Welcome to Shay Says. That's officially what I'm calling this now because my only ideas for clever titles are either rhyming or alliteration. Recently, Egoraptor released his long-awaited Sequelitis episode on The Legend of Zelda. If you don't know who Egoraptor is, he's the guy I'm pretty much ripping off. Anyway, it's a great video, it's enjoyable throughout, and Egoraptor makes a ton of interesting points. Whilst watching, however, I found myself disagreeing with a few things as well as feeling like a few points could be expanded upon. And since I had a break in my busy schedule of making friends and flirting, I thought I'd put together this response video. As such, you'd be better off having watched Sequelitis first, otherwise nothing I'm going to say is going to make any sense. It's half an hour long, so if you don't have time to watch both that video and this one, go and watch that one, and I hope you can come back to this one later. For those of you that are left, let me just say that this isn't entirely directed at Egoraptor's points, think of it more as me using his points to talk off of. The first point I want to expand on are the introductions and tutorials in the Zelda games. The original Zelda's introduction went like this. Most players' curiosity would drive them to explore the cave first, but if they didn't, they'd be driven back by the enemies on the other screens. It's an elegant and effective introduction that might even provide a gratifying moment when the player returns to the battlefield, sword in hand, and turns the table on the Tektites. It also introduces the player to how ruthless Zelda is. It starts as it means to go on. Besides that though, the game does nothing to teach you. The first time I played Zelda 1, which was on the NES Classics line for the Game Boy Advance, I didn't manage to beat the first dungeon before I turned it off. Perhaps I was spoiled by the smoother controls found in the later games, but I found that Zelda 1 was impenetrable for quite some time. Even nowadays, having completed the game and loving its appeal, I still think it's kinda pants at teaching its player about its rules and limitations. It doesn't teach you about its items in any way, and it doesn't even hint at the solutions to some of its more obscure obstacles. I found level 5 completely by accident. I was just being a dick. I got lost and kept walking up to be stubborn. I mean, I get it, the joy is in the discovery, but I think being so obstinately unhelpful can, and does, turn a lot of people off. I don't think it would diminish the game's feel if it were a little more accommodating at the beginning, perhaps if, by exploring, the player could find old men who would give them clues. And I don't mean like, Dodongo dislikes smoke, cause what the hell's a Dodongo? Egoraptor admits himself in a recent episode of Game Grumps that he used a walkthrough for Zelda 1. That's not me trying to shame him. I honestly think there is no problem with enjoying your games how you like, especially if you're trying to commentate over them at the same time. But I think it's the most effective way to prove my point. I mean, I used a walkthrough for Zelda 1. Everybody I know used a walkthrough for Zelda 1. If you didn't, I reckon the game would be a lot more of a chore, involving a lot of fruitless wandering. I, personally, think this is poor game design. There isn't really an aha moment associated with pushing all the blocks until one moves, and there isn't really an aha moment with wasting bombs because you have no idea which wall will break. The game's appeal is in its unparalleled exploration, and I understand that good conveyance would hurt this aspect of it. But I also reckon a lot of people will resort to using a walkthrough to complete the game, which doesn't really strike me as a particularly desirable trait for a developer unless you're trying to make more money off Nintendo Power Guides. A Link to the Past did this very well. I stuck with it until the end as the game worked with me to give me a direction. As a result, I think it's infinitely more accessible than Zelda 1. On repeat playthroughs though, it takes a bit of time to get going because of how pushy it is. The original Zelda doesn't suffer from this problem because of its sink or swim attitude. Here's a big world, go and explore is a more appealing prospect. I just don't think it has to sacrifice accessibility in order to accomplish this. Honestly, I think that the best introduction would be Ocarina of Time were it not for one huge issue. Let's look at the good of that introduction first. After introducing its setting and acclimating its player to a 3D environment via Navi, the game lets the player loose in a safe area. This area has little danger of death or confusion. The one part that does forces the player to make use of 3D perspective. Here, the player is taught in no uncertain terms how to play the game through mostly optional NPC dialogue. They're tasked with the collection of a sword and a shield, which is obviously something that the player wants, and in order to accomplish this, the player needs to collect 40 rupees. This gives them a lot of freedom in how they approach the task, while also encouraging them to explore every nook and cranny to root out those hidden rupees. Afterwards, they're shown how the dungeon system works, and then given some motivation to go out into Hyrule at large. The beauty of this introduction, in principle anyway, is that it allows veteran players to blast through it. I know what a sword is, I know the best way to collect the rupees, and I can be in the first dungeon within minutes. It's the best of both worlds, engaging the old while introducing the new. Or at least it bloody would be if it went for the incredible amount of verbal diarrhea. The game introduces and reiterates meaningless plot points over and over again, and what would be a brisk, engaging introduction turns into a turgid chore. I mean, do we really need to be told about Ganon? We get told about him in Hyrule Castle anyway. Same with the goddess cutscene, which isn't even a particularly amazing story anyway. 3 goddesses made the world, right, there you go, that's it in 5 words. We could definitely do away with the love triangle between Link, Saria and Mido as a mandatory interaction, because it goes absolutely nowhere. None of these story elements have any impact on the gameplay, and could easily have been little Easter eggs for curious players to find. All of that said, Ocarina does a bunch of stuff right with its story. It has a fleshed out world to discover and explore, which is a huge boon to the game. It also understands the importance of context. I think Egoraptor's right, I don't think the game needs to give its players this big of a push to inherently want to explore a world and fight monsters. But at the same time, giving the player some motivation is a great way to invest them. The Great Deku Tree dying does have an impact on the gameplay as it contextualises the player's goal outside of an abstract curiosity. Instead of being, explore the dungeon because I don't know, it's explore the dungeon because it's the dying wish of the ancient deity that raised you. Which is an admittedly less snappy title. If you want proof of this motivation in action, check out Danny's reaction to Aryll being kidnapped in Wind Waker. I mean, not to speak for the guy, but he seemed pretty into it. That is to say that he seemed invested, not into kidnapping little girls. My point is, as immediate as Zelda 1 is, I think Ocarina would have suffered without its context. On a basic level, good context is important because it lets first-timers know where to go without having to resort to a walkthrough. The key is balance. Too much story and you lose people who just want to play the game, as well as discourage people from replaying. However, gameplay without context can often create a barrier between the game and first-time players. Skyward Sword spent ages trying to give its player motivation, and the beginning of that game's a chore as a result, to say nothing of the rest of the experience. On the other hand, Zelda 1 just keeps stum, and I've seen it turn many players away because they can't get a handle on it. I was one of those players. I think you can have the best of both worlds by having fleshed out characters in a fleshed out world, but not making it essential for the player to push through this exposition in order to reach the next part of the game. Just delegate non-essential elements to optional dialogue and there you go. Moving on then, I disagree with Egoraptor about the Z targeting in Ocarina. I don't think it's right to blame the Z targeting for Ocarina's failure to combine combat and environment. In my opinion, Z targeting is a great way to let a player deal with a 3D environment. They can either not lock on to get a wider view, or they can lock on to focus down an enemy and improve accuracy in a way that would otherwise be very fiddly. Again, I have to speak in principle here as Ocarina's execution of this is kinda lacking. The main issue with Ocarina's lock-on is something that Egoraptor picked up on, the enemy design and placement. Later games, especially the Wind Waker, proved what the control scheme was capable of. Expanded item utility and smoother controls in general really helped this lock-on mechanic to shine. This resulted in much smoother battles. One of the most exhilarating and memorable parts of that game was using your brand new Master Sword to slice through hordes of moblins and darknuts. You had to keep an eye on your surroundings to make sure you didn't have too many of them on you at once. Combined with the expanded item use in combat, which is something that Zelda really needs more of, the selective focus afforded thanks to Z targeting led to a very satisfying experience. You were in complete control at all times, and I think it shows how a gauntlet of enemies like those found in the 2D games could work in 3D. Z targeting adds to this. In fact, my major disappointment with this section is that it's the only one like that in the entire game. My point is that, sure, the combat design in Ocarina was rather rudimentary, but I just don't think that was due to the Z targeting. I think it's just the rest of the game failing to capitalise on it. The waiting, however, is a very real problem. The aforementioned Master Sword sequence in Wind Waker was made all the more satisfying by the enemies requiring some fancy footwork to deal with them all. Often Ocarina of Time's enemies will just have a staring contest with Link. You'll peer over your shields at one another as you circle pointlessly around like some kind of waltz for germaphobes. Many enemies can be beaten by just holding Z and R, waiting for them to attack, and then pressing B once they're done. Often the enemies are programmed to attack one at a time. Fighting twin Stalfos loses a lot of tension when you realise the second one's just kind of warming up in the background. The water temple springs to mind. It's the most tedious section of the entire game. Every moment is punctuated by another trip to the menu to change your bloody shoes. Even the bosses in the dungeons are associated with a lot of waiting. Egoraptor mentions the bosses in Ocarina being taken out with the same tactic each time. Compare this to A Link to the Past, in which you fought a gauntlet against a massive foe using your quick reactions and acknowledgement of contextual clues in order to best them. In Ocarina, having the boss be weak to whatever the dungeon item is removes any romance or tension from the encounter. It feels like more of a formality than a challenge. It's like a glorified puzzle where the solution is the same every time. But while we're on the subject of bosses, let's talk about treasure chests and mini-bosses. I saw some confusion in the comments of Sequelitis, with people asking how Egoraptor could like the tension of getting a treasure chest in A Link to the Past, but dislike the tension of getting a treasure chest in Ocarina. I think he explained it fairly clearly, but I'll explain it here for completion's sake. The key difference is that in A Link to the Past, the game isn't telling you how to feel. Through its gameplay, it creates a situation in which you, the player, feel tense. The game teases you by showing you the chest. Implicit in this is a reward, and thus tension is created as you anticipate what that reward could be. In Ocarina of Time, the chest is just dropped unceremoniously in front of you. There is no anticipation, as it's more of a surprise. By the time you know the chest exists, you can open it. To compensate, the game tried to give the illusion of anticipation by having Link be awestruck. It's the difference between the game making you feel suspenseful, and the game telling you, this is suspenseful, feel suspended. After your first playthrough, this animation loses all of its impact, as you know what's inside the chest, and it just serves to waste your time. A Link to the Past doesn't suffer from this problem, since the chest opening is instantaneous. What's interesting about this though is that all the big items in Ocarina are given to you following a mini-boss. An easy way to build some anticipation would be to show you the chest before locking it away when the boss appears. That way, you're battling for something you can easily contextualise. I need to beat this boss to get an item. You'd also be more likely to retry if you died. You'd be more likely to keep playing with the promise of a new item just out of your reach, motivating and exciting you. It's this kind of design that Zelda should be striving for. It should create situations and scenarios that the player cares about, even if it's just on a superficial level, rather than create situations that Link cares about and then expect the player to feel those emotions via proxy. I mean, this is why Majora's Mask was so spectacular. It didn't sit there and go, the moon is ominous, Link is scared. It simply hung the moon over you and waited for you to notice. For better or worse, the Zelda formula at this point is the Ocarina formula, considering the amount of games that use it as a template. However, I think that Egoraptor's point was that, as a sequel to A Link to the Past, that formula is disappointing. I know, a show called Sequelitis talking about sequels, it's mad. It dismisses the inherent strength of video games by having the player empathise with Link, rather than evoking emotions in the player themselves. It simulates emotion, rather than creates emotion. The big question I'd ask though is, why is Ocarina of Time built like this? Well, it's cause it's 3D, innit? Even as early as Super Mario 64, Nintendo evidently understood that 3D couldn't work like 2D. They didn't have the time or resources to craft as many levels as they could in 2D, and besides which, jumping into turtles just couldn't hope to be as accurate. Instead, they focused on fleshing out and exploring a smaller pool of levels. And they were right to do so, because look at Super Mario 3D World, a game that tried to compromise 3D levels and 2D sensibilities. It was a really confused game as a result of this. It has neither the accuracy of a 2D game nor the depth of a 3D one. With Ocarina of Time, Nintendo understood that the combat couldn't hope to be as simple or as accurate as it was in A Link to the Past. The levels couldn't hope to be as immediately apparent, so the focus shifted accordingly. Ocarina of Time is more slow-paced and immersive. This is in order to compensate for its inability to be simple in the gameplay department. More attention was paid to the world and artistic direction. Each dungeon has its own distinct graphics and music, absorbing the player into a new environment and creating a more fully realised world. In short, Ocarina of Time makes up the difference in atmosphere, even if, speaking mechanically, A Link to the Past is the superior game. Ocarina added to its direction with more linear game design. There's a strict sequence of events which is often wielded as a criticism. I don't think it is, and I'm going to go off on one about why that is now. Linear gameplay is not a criticism, it's a design choice that comes with its own set of pros and cons. Admittedly, it's probably not a design choice you should be associating with Zelda, which is ostensibly about adventure, but nevertheless, Ocarina of Time was doing it deliberately. Linear game design allows for the gameplay to be planned. It allows the designers to design sequences on a very intimate level. They can add new set pieces that are completely different to anything the player has seen before or since. They can adjust the pacing of a section more easily, or construct scenarios to evoke specific emotions. These sequences would be completely impossible if the player could approach from any direction. In Ocarina of Time's case, it allows the game to absorb the player a little more. Because the game knows you can't access the water temple before the forest temple, it can add a mechanic where you can only attack underwater using the hook shot, without fear of turning the player off because you don't have that item yet. Furthermore, if a game hopes to have any intricacy to its narrative, it needs to be linear. I mean, when you're reading a book, you don't skip between chapters, you go from beginning to middle to end, unless it's like Lanark. Similarly, a game's narrative, if it hopes to be intricate, has to follow that rule. It needs to know whereabouts its player is going to be and when they are going to be in that place at all times. For example, in Ocarina of Time, because the game knows that the player is likely to return to Kakariko Village after the Water Temple, it can put a cutscene there. This not only lets the player know where they need to go next, but it also advances the story a little. Although, all of that said, I don't think anybody could realistically call Ocarina of Time's narrative intricate. You know what? Maybe Ocarina's not the best example. So let's look at two other games, one that I absolutely adore and the other my favourite game. Namely, Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion respectively. Yeah, wait, hold on. Before you go, let me stress that I love Fusion partly for nostalgic reasons. If you were to ask me objectively which were the better game, I'd probably have to go with Super Metroid. Because Super Metroid is so non-linear, it has an immense satisfaction in exploring and pushing the game's boundaries. You can go down and collect the high jump boots, or, if you're good enough, you can perform a cleverly timed wall jump in order to reach Kraid early. That's a very basic example, because I can't be arsed getting more footage, but it serves the point. Fusion, on the other hand, has only one sequence-breaking opportunity that requires an insane level of skill and patience, and is actually accounted for anyway. I like Fusion because it frequently used its linear design to evoke genuine emotion. You see, the linearity allows the story and the context to be constructed more carefully. I can emotionally invest myself more as the story does a brilliant job in gradually ramping up the pressure. As the game is linear, it can make each sequence incrementally tenser. The story and the gameplay complement one another perfectly. They come together to create an atmosphere that's out of this world. And that really invested me. The game was no longer just a simple game, but a thrilling adventure. Take this bit as a prominent example. When I first played this, I hesitated for ages up on that ledge, but I dreaded going down. It was one way and I didn't know what was down there except for the SAX, which had been hyped up for the entire game as a foe that I could never defeat. For me, the game ceased to be a game at this moment. I wasn't thinking in terms of tactics or mechanics, I was just utterly terrified. Take Skyrim. The world is so huge that it's constructed from the equivalent of cardboard and sticky tape, and there's only a small pool of things that the game can be expected to do. It's spread too thin for it to have any particularly memorable moments. Because of the system limitations of the Nintendo 64, I think Nintendo lacked confidence in providing an open world in 3D a la Zelda 1. So rather than try and fail, they took a more linear approach. They carefully crafted the game to immerse the player, giving it a slower pace and a more forgiving difficulty in order to minimise the risk of the player becoming out of sync with the game. The key factor is immersion. Nintendo couldn't hope to create a 3D game as tight as A Link to the Past, so they focused instead on creating a game where you wouldn't notice that fact. To quote Yahtzee Croshaw, if a game can draw you in, it can make up for a lot of flaws, and I think that's what Ocarina was going for. Zelda 1, on the other hand, is totally engrossing, but not really immersive. On some level, I'm always aware that I'm playing a game, which is fine, as that game is much tighter than Ocarina, but it just doesn't have the same emotional factor. If I were to compare Ocarina of Time to A Link to the Past, I'd probably compare them to a bath and a shower respectively. A Link to the Past is like a shower. Bet that's a sentence you didn't really expect to hear today. It's fun, it's fast, it's instantly gratifying. Ocarina of Time is more like a bath. You have to relax, sink into it, let it envelop you. Neither are inherently bad, they're both good at what they do. It's just not the same as what the other one does. Obviously, whichever one you prefer is entirely up to you. My point is, neither is an inherent criticism. But can they coexist? Is there a hypothetical game where linearity, non-linearity, atmosphere, immersion, exploration and combat all come together to construct something better than the sum of their parts? That was a long sentence. Yes, but it's not hypothetical. It's called Dark Souls. Yeah, no, I bet you saw that coming. To clarify, I don't think Zelda should just copy Dark Souls, that'd be rubbish. There are a ton of differences that would make it unsuitable. The deliberately clunky control scheme, for example, or its almost impenetrable difficulty. It's an exhausting, dense game. There were multiple times when playing that I didn't bother checking all of the rooms because the reward just wasn't worth the risk. That, of course, wouldn't be suitable for Zelda, a game about checking rooms. However, Dark Souls has a lot of the right elements. It's got a varied artistic direction and more immersive world like Ocarina of Time. This is even stronger as it's shown, not told. It has the instant gameplay gratification and exploration as Zelda 1. It's basically non-linear after the brief tutorial with the only roadblocks being the difficulty. It even has Majora's Mask's oppressive atmosphere and sense of facing something bigger than you are. The combat's great as well. It might seem unintuitive to use R3 to lock on at first, after Ocarina standardised the trigger as the go-to button for this. But when you learn that it grants an easy way to toggle and change the lock, it becomes a superior system. The controls even work well whether you're locked on or not. There's a real tug-of-war with the pace of the battle. Being aggressive will often get you killed, so you have to lure enemies into situations in which you have the advantage. This means that each fight is an ordeal. You can't take any encounter in the game for granted, which works for Dark Souls, perhaps not so much for Zelda. I thought it was worth mentioning anyway. Dark Souls also combines combat and environment very well. Often you have to take cover when you heal as the enemies become more aggressive when you do so. You also have to make sure not to antagonise more than one enemy at a time to prevent yourself from becoming overwhelmed. This requires careful movement and thoughtful approaches to exploring the area. One of the most seamless uses of environment in combat though is a boss called the Ceaseless Discharge. You can either battle this boss the normal way or you can trick him into jumping off a ledge in an attempt to grab you. If you attack him when he does so, he falls into the lava below, resulting in an instant kill. This combines puzzle solving and boss battling in a much more satisfying way than use item on boss. It also incorporates the environment. It requires critical thinking and keen perception, as well as the guts to attempt it. The player is rewarded for using their brain and thinking outside the box. Now, to emphasise slapping a Zelda skin on Dark Souls would not create the perfect Zelda game for a number of reasons you can probably figure out for yourself. But I think that it does a lot of things right, and captures some of the same satisfaction that the older Zelda games had. It's certainly a more satisfying experience than a lot of the newer Zelda games are. Speaking of which, A Link Between Worlds was amazing. One of the few things it did wrong though was structure. It's really great for exploration, particularly in the non-linear second half of the game. However, because you can go in any order, the game has to account for that and, as such, has almost no difficulty scaling. It kind of fails to build towards a climax. This is compounded by the item renting. It's a great idea as it totally lubricates exploration, but I think it also prevents the player from really feeling like they've grown in strength. Later dungeons and enemies don't incorporate earlier items as the game has to assume that the player doesn't have them. Compare with the original Zelda. Everything is scaled for difficulty, but if you want to head to, say, Dungeon 3 first, you can. Your funeral, well, you can. I don't think this system is perfect as it kind of stunts exploration through difficulty. I think a compromise could be reached, but anyway, this is what made Zelda 1 so engaging. Once you get better, there are many ways to approach the game. Ocarina of Time, on the other hand, seems to get worse with every subsequent playthrough. But here's the thing, last time I played Ocarina was my millionth playthrough, and I was doing a Let's Play, so I couldn't really immerse myself as I had to concentrate and talk and pish. This leads me to a conclusion. The reason I think Ocarina is so well received, and the reason I think the game was designed the way it was, is because the first playthrough is as spectacular as possible. Think about it. Egoraptor said that battles in Ocarina are designed to feel difficult rather than actually be difficult, to give the illusion of accomplishing something. Additionally, another excellent reviewer, Matthew Matosis, said that Zelda games are more about making you feel smart rather than requiring you to be smart. Finding an eye isn't a puzzle, but it makes you feel like you're thinking for yourself. There is a very small aha moment associated with looking around and seeing the eye. Even the sequences like the bridge in the Fire Temple give the illusion of danger, designed to feel treacherous rather than actually be treacherous. If these situations were dangerous or tough, they might turn players away. Factoring in the environment, which is designed to immerse you in a fleshed out world, I would posit that Ocarina of Time was designed to make the player feel like the hero of time, without actually requiring them to possess the skill or intelligence necessary to truly claim that title. Do you remember what I said earlier about Metroid Fusion ceasing to exist as a game for me? That I wasn't thinking about it in terms of gameplay at all. That's what I think Ocarina is going for. You basically roleplay Link. As the hero of time, you meet the indigenous peoples of the land and you right the wrongs committed against them. This is why the dialogue spends so much time contextualising everything. If you want to see what it would be like without context, check out Kakariko Village and A Link to the Past. They don't bother their shirts about anything. They don't give a flying toss. It creates this strange disconnect between the player and the rest of the world. You're on this epic quest to save the kingdom and they don't really seem at all fussed. Ocarina does a brilliant job contextualising itself, and it does so in one shocking moment. The second you emerge from the Temple of Time in the future, you know exactly what's at stake. You know what everything should look like. You've spent the entirety of the game up until this point going back and forth to Castletown. And now the people are gone, replaced with these horrifying monsters. The sky's dark and foreboding, and Hyrule Castle has been turned into a looming edifice. That was one of those moments that Ocarina ceased to be a game for me. Throughout Ocarina of Time, you're playing out the illusion of being the hero of this rich, vibrant world. It's not just a game, it's an experience, or at least that's the intended effect. You could argue this is bad design, but I think it's genius. The first playthrough is a blast as a result, providing that the game can absorb you. Yes, it is a Disney tour, if you will, but it's so cleverly disguised it took me a while to notice. It suffers from diminishing returns, like every subsequent playthrough becomes less engaging as you already know what's coming, and without autonomy you can't change that. Also, if you can't immerse yourself, such as if the game fails to grab you or you're doing a let's play, you won't enjoy Ocarina of Time as much. In that case, without the sheen of the experience, you're left only with the technicalities of the gameplay, and you might just end up wondering what the fuss is about. For me, I don't think my problem with Ocarina is its design. It set out to do something different from Zelda 1 or A Link to the Past, and I think it succeeded. I mean, you only have to look at the review scores to realise that. No, I think my problem with Ocarina is that it's taken as gospel both by Nintendo and by the fans. I mean, look at Sequelitis. The video opens and closes with Egoraptor trying to placate Ocarina's fans. What's interesting to me isn't that he did that, that's a sensible move. It's that he felt that he had to do it. Does that make sense? Probably not. He knew that Ocarina was so unquestionably beloved that he had to head off knee-jerk reactions, even when his reasoning was sound. Maybe the biggest thing to take away from Sequelitis isn't that Ocarina is a good or a bad game, or even a good or a bad sequel. Maybe the biggest thing to take away from Sequelitis is that by ignoring dissenting opinions we encourage stagnation. Maybe by refusing to acknowledge Ocarina as anything other than a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, we close off discussion and the improvement that comes with criticism. Maybe that's why it took me ages to notice Ocarina's flaws, because it was so continually touted as a 10 out of 10 masterpiece that I didn't really stop to question it. And maybe that's why the Zelda formula has become so trite nowadays. Anyway, that's me done. If you haven't seen Egoraptor's videos before... Yeah, okay, of course you have. Here's a link anyway. If you'd like to see the Ocarina of Time playthrough I mentioned in this video, here's a link to that. If you'd like to see more from me, here's a link to my last video. It's about Samus being sexy. I hate sex, me. the worst. If you'd like to perform the other YouTube functions such as liking or subscribing, I won't insult your intelligence by telling you where the big buttons just below the video that you should definitely press are. Join me next time when I rip the piss out of Sonic the Hedgehog. Cheers!